All right, so let's get started, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Zoning for Stronger Regions. We're here today to talk about the connection between zoning and economic development, how the individual or the invisible, levers that govern our cities can spur or hinder economic development. My name is Matthew Leader. I'm from the National Association of Regional Councils. This webinar is part of the Economic Development District Community of Practice, which is an effort funded by the U.S. Economic Development Administration and led by the National Association of Development Organizations. If you're here joining us from an economic development district or a regional council that's considering becoming an economic development district, which I know we definitely have some people here from regional councils, then I encourage you to take a look at the NADO EDD Community of Practice website. It's got great resources, webinars, training for economic development districts to make the most out of the program. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat. After this webinar, I encourage you to take a look at all of the great things they have to offer on their website. Quick disclaimer. Everything said during this webinar is the opinion of the author and is not necessarily representative of the Economic Development Administration. And today I'm proud to introduce our guest. She is an architect, attorney, policymaker, and professor from famously the one city in America that does not have zoning, Houston, Texas. She's the former chair of Hartford's Planning and Zoning Commission, where she led efforts to overhaul the city zoning code. She's the founder and director of the National Zoning Atlas, which is an effort to digitize and democratize our nation's complex array of zoning laws. She is the author of Key to the City, which is a book about how zoning shapes our cities. And she is currently a professor at the George Washington University School of Law. I'm proud to be joined by one of the nation's foremost experts in zoning and land use law, Sara Bronin. Welcome.
Thank you for that speaking power, being able to unmute. It's great. No problem. Thanks, Matthew. And nice to see everybody on the call. And I see that there's a pretty big array of folks from all over the country. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So Matthew really asked me to talk about two different things. One about maybe a little bit about my book. Second, about the National Zoning Atlas, which is a project that I've been working on, both of which speak to the question of the title of the webinar, which is zoning and economic development. I'll maybe start with the book. So this recently published Key to the City, How Zoning Shapes Our World, really drew from, as Matthew said, my experience growing up in Houston, which takes an anything goes approach to land uses, which means that where I grew up in the neighborhood of Gulfton, if anybody's from Houston, probably know where that is. Across the street from my apartment, there was a strip mall, a nightclub, a gas station, a self-storage facility, all uses that may or may not be compatible with things like housing for places where families live. Very wide streets focus on the car. And again, a really anything goes approach to land uses. But the book is also rooted in my experience serving as the Planning and Zoning Commission chair in the city of Hartford, where for 7 years, I, among other things, led a zoning overhaul, changes to the city plan or new city plan, a climate action plan, new for the first time potentially because we couldn't find them, subdivision regulations, as well as updates to the inland wetland regulations. So for those of you who are working at the local level, I'll focus on zoning today, but of course, as you know, there's a smorgasbord of other land use laws that affect economic development. In that role as the chair of the Planning and Zoning Commission, I really came to understand how powerful zoning was as a driver for economic development. So the city of Hartford, a city founded in 1635, a very historic city, lots of neighborhoods that are centered around commercial corridors, historic corridors, again, 400-year-old city, And I know there's some folks from Waterbury on the line, so you guys know Hartford. But just to paint a picture for others, it was a city, it is a city, a central city that has a downtown, so high-rise buildings, but is land constrained. So it's highly, tends to be, it is a low-income city, 85% Black and Latino and people of color, and one that sits within the context of a broader suburban region that is very wealthy and also much in demographic terms, much whiter as well and better educated than the residents of the city of Hartford. The city had set up itself through zoning, among other policies, to be really a place that almost was serving the suburbs rather than serving the residents of the city. And so, in a zoning overhaul, what we did was we really tried to change a number of different aspects. Housing, which is a key driver of economic growth and activity, was constrained by the old code. We legalized an array of housing options in the new code. We made, in fact, all housing as of right. In the zoning code, too, we had onerous parking mandates for residential and commercial uses. We lifted those. We focused on the historic main streets and added a diversity of uses, making them more mixed use, again, legalizing housing, eliminating the parking mandates that had prevented conversions from the historic buildings and had in fact resulted in historic buildings being torn down, and banned fast foods establishments, gas stations, drive-throughs, large curb cuts, and some of the other things that had really degraded the city's fabric over time, and in turn made it much more difficult for small businesses to succeed on those main streets. Citywide, we just also took a much more streamlined approach to zoning, reducing the use table, which was 73 pages, to 3 pages, basically having a very clear guide as to what uses were allowed where. And also, in particular, a New England issue allowing for industrial mill buildings to be converted to something that wasn't industrial anymore, because industrial buildings are industrial facilities are not necessarily as needed, at least not in New England, as they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So that at a very high level are some of the things that we did in Hartford related to economic growth. It's a story that I do tell in the book. So I talk about Hartford, but I also include other cities as well. So Baltimore, a post-industrial city like Hartford, a much larger city, one that has rezoned some of its industrial lands to allow for a mix of uses, ushering in a new era of vibrancy, ushering in housing and 24-hour development in areas that were previously just thought of as industrial. I write in the book about a brewer who tried to locate within a historically industrial building, and the way that zoning had to be adapted to accommodate that. And at a related level, there's a chapter in the book about arts and how arts really are a key driver in economic development, as well as nightlife, a whole chapter devoted to nightlife where I spotlight Austin, Nashville, a bit on Baltimore, and the topic of not only things like nightclubs and bars and late night restaurants, but also adult uses. So if those are issues in your community, I'd love to talk about that chapter. In the book, what I try to do is tell stories about places and identify the way that zoning has risen to the challenge of addressing the issues that communities have identified. I'd love to hear more in the Q&A about the kinds of issues that you all are wrestling with, and to maybe pull in some of the examples from the book. I should add that in addition to a focus, about a third or a little bit more of the book is focused on economic development. I think it's really important to think about zoning as a tool to help communities meet their own needs. So whether that's transportation security or housing security, not only, of course, an economic growth issue, but also a very human needs issue, as well as food security. For those who don't see food and the food economy as a fundamental part of a local economy, I hope chapter 7 of the book will disabuse you of that notion and maybe highlight how zoning can create food, both food security, but also help people grow food themselves and convert that into productive and profitable uses. And also, the book touches on designing communities for delight. So, looking at trees as essential urban infrastructure. Maybe I didn't cover this so much in the book, but to the extent that zoning codes help to promote tree plantings and landscaping, that can also improve property values. Still in that vein of designing for delight, looking at the street and streetscapes and how zoning can help to influence those. And then finally looking in chapter 10 at tools like a form-based code, which helps to articulate design standards for buildings, including things like heights, minimum heights, window treatments, size of windows and placement of windows, roof types, patterns like porches that you see in urban locations, and so on. So again, while the book does focus on stories and has a big part of it on economic development related zoning, there are these other things that, yes, can contribute to local economies, but can also contribute to quality of life. So I certainly encourage you to pick up the book if you're at all interested in zoning, and I'm happy to answer some questions about that as well. With that, I'm just going to turn briefly to the National Zoning Atlas. So this is a tool that is, I think, a pretty cool tool, and I'm going to just show you just with a quick screen share how the National Zoning Atlas works. Because I've just talked a bit about Connecticut. Can you see this? It looks like it's going to maybe taking a little bit to load. So as it's loading, there you go. I'm going to just zoom into Connecticut, and actually, let me just zoom back out to the national map. Get home. So the map starts like this, and here's a map of the entire state, entire country rather, and you can see on this map the places that we have completed analysis for. So those are places that are purple or gray. In the purple, those are places that have zoning, and the gray are places that do not have zoning. With the completion of Virginia, just last week, we have completed 12 states as well as DC, Alaska and Hawaii, which are not shown on this map, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Virginia, and then 5 New England states, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. So to get to a place that you're familiar with, you can actually zoom in. So I'll zoom back into Connecticut if it lets me. I can go to Rhode Island instead and just zoom back out. So in Connecticut, where the first zoning atlas was completed, and I'll go ahead and zoom right into Hartford while we're here. And you can do that actually by going to this zoom function here. When I'm in Connecticut, you can drop down. I'm going to select, I've selected West Hartford, and I think I'll stick, no, let me select Hartford. And when I've selected Hartford, you can see that it shows up on the map. What the map does is it's basically read 890,000 pages of zoning codes. So my team of 28 full-time staff members has read them, and it has extracted information about zoning into a single apples to apples format that you can find online at zoningatlas.org. So the map at a very basic level tells us where people can build housing. And so, for example, when I click on single family homes, the map shows virtually all land that was purple is still shown. So the purple land here is this light purple is primarily residential. Here's the zoning district type. The medium purple is mixed with residential, and that peach that just disappeared is non-residential. So I'll bring the peach back by untoggling this filter and then add apartments to the query. And here you can see that almost the entire map turned white. What that means is that across all this area in Connecticut, you cannot build apartments as of right, 4 or more units. That's for a lot of different reasons, extremely problematic to the state of Connecticut's growth. The governor very shamefully vetoed a bill that would have legalized more housing across the state just a few weeks ago. It was very, very disappointing to many housing advocates, but the legislature had passed this great multifaceted bill. So this map is going to stay the same for a while, unfortunately. But if you look at Hartford, a bright spot in the region, as well as New Britain, you see 53% of zoned acres in Hartford allow for multifamily housing, and it doesn't have any parking mandates. So what that means is that you don't have to. So that's one of the things we lifted, and I talk about that in the book in the city. So I encourage you to explore, and this is just a very, very brief view of this, but I encourage you to explore the map. As I reset the filters, you can actually go down into advanced filters and see, for example, where single family land is allowed. You can toggle on minimum lot sizes. So I want to know, where do we have a minimum lot size of a half an acre? None of that nonsense in Hartford, but everywhere around, it's not only half an acre, it's not only 1 acre, 40,000 square feet, but actually 50% of land in Connecticut requires an 80,000 square foot minimum. Oh, I zoomed too far out, so you won't be able to see it, but 80,000 square foot minimum. And so you see all of these areas around the state, including in areas in and around New Haven, and certainly areas in and around New York City. You see not only 80,000 square foot, but I just hovered right there over a 4 acre zoning district. So I encourage you to check out the map. I'm going to stop sharing there because I know, Matthew, there were a lot of questions that came in even before the webinar started. So I think we're probably best off devoting the majority of our time to Q&A, and I'll probably pop the map back up at some point. But hopefully those broad comments provided an overview. Does that sound
Yeah,
good?
that sounds great.
Great.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I think I definitely enjoyed kind of getting a lay of the land with the National Zoning Atlas. For those of you listening, I just put both the link to Key to the City and the National Zoning Atlas in the chat. I've read the book. It's very, very good. Has a lot of different case studies that could be applicable to your region. And then the National Zoning Atlas is in there as well. So before we get into live Q&A, I have a few questions prepared, and then we also have questions that you guys submitted during registration. If you do have live questions, there's a Q&A. It's like a little text speech bubble with a question mark in it on the bottom of your screen. You can select that and type in your question there, and then we'll take those questions at the end. But Sarah, to start off, I guess let's talk about the recent focus on zoning. YIMBYism, maybe 10, 15 years ago, really became a buzzword. Now abundance is kind of sweeping a lot of the political landscape. Does that popularity make you cautious about your work, or does it make you optimistic that there is some momentum for change? My bad. There we go.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And for the concept of YIMBY, yes, in my backyard, is something that housing advocates have embraced, and I think it's some people say, well, the YIMBY moniker has had some tarnish to it over the years, but I actually think it's a pretty effective way to communicate the essence of the movement, which is yes, in my backyard, yes, we want new neighbors, and there's some new terminology and new organizations that have come out, like Welcoming Neighbors Network is a different way to say YIMBY. The abundance movement, to the extent that it is a movement, I would say it's a movement that relies very heavily on many years and even decades of work by YIMBY advocates. So if it's a way to continue to pull people into the idea that more housing is better, then I'm all for it.
Fantastic. And you talk about a couple of, some of this during your book, but I'm wondering if you could kind of address some of the risks to deregulating the zoning landscape as it is, and bringing down some of the barriers. What are some of the risks that you foresee, and then how would you kind of counter those risks? And go.
Thank you. So in terms of the risks of deregulation in general, some people say, well, maybe what that means is that we will have an anything goes approach to Houston in it, like Houston does. In the book, I argue that there is a way to balance both loosening restrictions, particularly on housing, uh, and making sure that you have the kind of housing development that you want. As you mentioned in the intro, I'm a big preservationist, and I do appreciate the value of having coherently designed communities. And I do think that zoning codes can help with that, as I argue in the book, through things like form-based codes and protections to historic properties. The example I use in the book on the historic side, by the way, is Galveston, Texas, where I just spent a little bit of time, not too far from Houston, but they have historic district regulation through their zoning code, and it's a very interesting place. But the East End neighborhood, so it's a combination of a tourist attract a place that relies on tourism. It has a port. It has longtime residents and medical facilities and a medical school. But the East End neighborhood, amidst all of that, is one that I think has preserved its charm, and part of that is through zoning. So again, I guess I would just say I think there's a way to balance completely abandoning. So there, you don't have to completely abandon rules in order to have a good approach to deregulation that actually helps to meet community goals.
Absolutely. And in the book, I think you call it the Goldilocks zone. And then you talk about how zoning is kind of context dependent. So depending on where you are, it really matters that you have some good local knowledge of the area. So Sarah, a lot of people on this call right now represent regional organizations. So they're from councils of government, or they're from metropolitan planning organizations. So they don't control necessarily the local zoning and land use laws that we're kind of focusing on today. Do you think there's an opportunity for regional planners to get involved in the local zoning world?
I do think so. I think that for the regional planners, what we've seen on the National Zoning Atlas side is that they can help provide guidance, technical support, and you might call it a strong guidance, I guess, maybe I would say, to local governments, especially those that have the ability to provide grants or pass through grants to local institutions. So when it comes to, for example, the Cape Cod Commission, which is a regional organization that we've worked with in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, they have 15 towns within their jurisdiction, and they have done a lot on zoning analysis and best practices and issuing guidance. So that's one strategy that communities can use. For MPOs and others that might have access to funding, that's another structure, the funding structure and incentive structure, and or again, technical assistance grants and things like that, that can be used to help improve zoning at the local level, even without regulatory authority. At the same time, regional councils can be a really strong voice at the legislature. They can say, look, our hands are tied, but here's information that tells you why zoning has been such a huge deterrent for economic growth, because workers can't find housing, because people are wasting a ton of time on their commutes, because small businesses can't find people to work counter shifts, and so on and so forth. Those are the arguments that regional councils should be making at the legislature to say we need more housing across the region, and all the communities in our region should be stepping up. Now, they don't like to do that because often it's the local government, necessarily, if the local governments are the ones who are paying the membership fees and supporting the regional commissions. But in a lot of ways, I think regional councils have not fully exercised their power to help inform legislators about the regional approach. We've seen that in some states, we haven't seen it in other states, but I do encourage that kind of approach by regionals.
Definitely. There's a new Urban Institute report that surveyed a lot of our members, and it showed that, our members are interested in getting involved in the housing and planning connection, but they lack the authority and the resources to do so. So, this might be a good place to start. Let's go into the registration questions that we had people fill out. I see there's uh, just one question in the chat right now. So if you guys want to ask away, feel free. But let's get into the registration questions for a little bit. Sarah, our first question from registration is, what do you see as one of the biggest hindrances, zoning hindrances to economic development, and what are examples of solutions?
So I think part of the thing that I try to communicate to my book is in my book is that at a very basic level, the lack of mixed use zoning is probably one of the biggest deterrents to economic development. And so if you think about it, when you have single family zoned exclusive communities, for example, and you don't allow home businesses, something that was in big demand in COVID, daycares, maybe even little shops, accessory dwelling units or accessory commercial units where maybe a law firm might set up in a little separate building within a house. You really lack the ability to respond from an economic standpoint when conditions change and to meet the needs of people who may not want to drive anymore from single family only communities into downtowns, and may want their needs to be met within the communities themselves. So I'm a big proponent of trying to add additional non-residential uses in even retrofit existing residential neighborhoods where restrictive covenants don't prohibit that. And I would consider that to be one of the biggest issues that cities and regions, towns, suburbs have to tackle if they want to continue to thrive. Because especially COVID revealed that that we were very ill-equipped to have communities that were responsive to changing office arrangements and changing needs, and again, gathering spots, coffee shops, the whole thing. So that would be one. I also think zoning codes in general are very stagnant. So they have not changed significantly, most of them in 30, 40, 50 years. What were we even doing 50 years ago? I mean, the fact that zoning codes are seen as these almost biblical documents that cannot be changed is really problematic for American cities. We're seeing in the National Zoning Atlas a huge level of regulatory stagnation. We're seeing also, by the way, lack of access to codes. So we've just been working in Tulsa, Oklahoma region. We've been working in, we just did a webinar this afternoon about New Mexico zoning. And some of these places, you cannot get their codes. Colorado, we finished the whole state. 16 jurisdictions in Colorado didn't have their zoning codes. Okay, putting that aside, so access to information is key, but I do think that the two things that I mentioned, mixed use zoning as an opportunity, and zoning complexity and zoning stagnation, so simplifying zoning codes and updating them for modern needs is really, really important. And it's okay to throw out the old code. That's what we did in Hartford. We did it unanimously in one night. Again, a story that I tell in the book, which is now seen on the zoning atlas itself.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think keeping zoning codes flexible is very important, with changing work patterns, changing preferences, I think keeping things flexible, and that's why this renewed focus on zoning, I think, is so good. The next question we had from our registration is, what are some strategies to promote accessible housing and economic development in formerly industrial communities? And this person is asking specifically for places like New Britain, Connecticut. And I know you talked a little bit about the industrial mill kind of designation that you worked on in Connecticut. So, what are some strategies for formerly industrial communities?
So New Britain is a great example, and as you could probably guess, I'm somewhat familiar with New Britain. New Britain as a city, and I'll just click on my little zoning atlas here, has 21 zoning districts. Actually, not a excessive number compared to some of the places that we've seen, but it's a large number of zoning districts. And I'm looking. In fact, let me share my screen so you guys can see what I'm looking at right now. I'm looking at these. So when you click on the zoning map itself, so I just clicked into New Britain, and New Britain is highlighted here. You can actually scroll down, and this is not something that I showed you yet, but you can see each and every zoning district in the city of New Britain, which we happen to have on the map. You can see an industrial park zone, a general industry zone, a looks like there's a TOD, a transit-oriented development zone. Now, these are not big zones. They're 169 acres, 432 acres, but you can see right off the bat, housing is prohibited, 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe that's appropriate if there are toxic sites or some bad uses. You see down here, by the way, technology park, same, technology park commercial, same, and then urban industrial sort of same. Looking up at the map, and then shopping center and neighborhood business are the other two non-residential districts. Looking at the map, I mean, I'd ask in this community, what's going on in these districts? So here's this urban industrial district. Is this a large parcel with a mill building that could be rezoned? It's adjacent to the CBD, to the central downtown. Similarly, this industrial district, it's on the highway, both of these. So these white lines through are on the highway, but is this another opportunity for rezoning? Maybe it's here. Maybe this is the one, the neighborhood business zone, which should be rezoned to allow for residential. I think flexibility in these uses is really important because industrial sites, and you could see some of them in Hartford that have been rezoned. So if you're in New Britain, you're familiar with Hartford. So the Swift factory up here was rezoned for non-industrial uses. Capewell down here in South Downtown. Well, I won't get to all the buildings, but the Colt factory, something you can see from the highway if you're driving down 91. If you ever passed Hartford, it's the one with the Onion Dome, rezoned significantly. That's actually where the brewery that I mentioned is located. But I guess recognizing the reality that industrial uses are not going to come back is something that zoning codes can help communities do, and can provide a path for the future.
Sorry about that. Now I'm on mute. This question kind of goes off that, Sarah, but what zoning reforms have we seen that have improved housing affordability in regions?
So, again, that's a question that we address on the zoning atlas. We do have a number of state pages up. So if you go to the resources page and then go to states, if you're interested in a particular state, you can click on that. And if we've posted it, then, we have some resources there. I would say that in general, the biggest areas of regulatory activity include zoning for accessory dwelling units. We've seen a lot of rezonings at the statewide level, overrides of local governments, and so on. We've seen the legalization of 2, 3, and even 4 family housing in single family zones. We've seen states tackle parking mandates. That bill that Governor Lamont vetoed had a statewide lifting of parking mandates. if you think about it, if a developer wants to build anything, they're going to build enough parking to satisfy the demand that they project. There's no reason why an outdated 50-plus-year-old zoning code should be dictating parking mandates. That is a great policy. It is low-hanging fruit. That it would be like the number one thing that I would say, go for that. And more information can be found at the Parking Reform Network's website, which is a good one for those who have not heard of that organization. To me, parking reform is economic development reform. So that's a big one that I would point to. So maybe that provides a smorgasbord of responses, but I'll just put in one more plug since industrial and historic rezoning seems to be a topic of interest. Looking really closely at historic underused industrial buildings is a really great opportunity as well for new housing.
Fantastic. All right. So we've talked a little bit about housing and housing construction, affordability. The next two questions in our registration talk about some different areas. So I'll kind of leave it up to you, Sarah, which one you want to tackle. The first question is, how best should energy generation projects be planned in tandem with zoning and economic development opportunities? And then the second is, or you hear a lot about zoning barriers to housing construction. What about larger land uses like industrial sites and distribution centers? So you have energy generation and you have industrial sites and distribution centers. And I'll kind of leave that up to you about which one you want to tackle.
Yeah, so when it comes to those particular uses, we are logging in the zoning atlas what the most common non-residential use is for every zoning district that we've posted. And maybe I should have said at the beginning the number of zoning districts that we have posted. So I mentioned the number of pages we've read, but across the 7,800 plus individual local governments, actually 7,900 plus local governments on the map, we've published 86,195 zoning districts. That's what my status map tells me right now. So for each and every one of those, if there's a commercial use, we've logged what the most common is. So we have an idea. It doesn't show up on the map as an independent toggle, but we do have back-end information about where the industrial uses are tend to be zoned for, and public utility and transportation infrastructure and things like that. In terms of strategies to understand how to cite them, that's not something that we've focused on in the zoning atlas, but I have written on the renewable energy side, and in my role as the chair of the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, tried to grapple with a phenomenon that we might term, or that people have termed, and I've written an article called curbing energy sprawl, energy sprawl. So putting these large productive energy generators really far away is actually kind of an inefficient use of our probably an inefficient use of our land in some cases, but you lose so much in transmitting that energy to population centers that, for me, the thing that cities should really be promoting through zoning is distributed generation. So whether that's microgrids, and so again, like that's another topic. I'm a law professor. I write a lot of articles. Microgrids is a topic that I've written about and helped to support. The state of Connecticut's foray into microgrids in the early 2010s, continuing today, but cities have to be able to cite microgrids to allow for localized off-grid, connectable and unconnected. So basically it's a grid that can be disconnected from the main grid and power things like college campuses, hospitals, critical facilities. So microgrids, certainly renewable energy, and that needs to be legalized pretty much everywhere on solar rooftops of any kind, including in historic districts. And that's a topic that I tried to tackle in my federal role. Wind, that's a different topic altogether, not so much a zoning topic since a lot of wind is offshore, but a number of federal rules on that front as well. So that's energy. In terms of data centers, these are increasingly seen as incredibly terrible uses, both from a land use standpoint and from a water use standpoint. I was just in Arizona where they have been trying to attract data centers, which does not make sense in a place that doesn't have water. So data centers are a really tough one. They are not always called out specifically in zoning codes as an independent use. So they might be shoehorned into even an office use, maybe a warehouse use. But I would put a really big caution flag on data center permitting, and maybe even try to figure out, if you are a water poor community, whether these things should be popping up in your neighborhood at all. Their job projections also may or may not be fully realized. So that's for me an emerging land use that I don't know which way it's going to go, but right now it's not been too promising in some places.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sarah. Let's now go to the live Q&A. We have 4 questions in the Q&A. I want you guys to keep asking those questions as we go ahead and answer these. If you don't see it yet, it's the Q&A button is a speech bubble with a question mark in the middle of it, and it's right at the bottom of your screen. So feel free to ask away and write your question there. But the first question let's go to is from Rick Dunn. And Rick, it's good to see you on the call. Rick says, in your opinion, is it possible to deregulate suburban zoning and encourage density if there are not sufficient or accessible transit options, and the result is increased automobile use?
It's a bit of a chicken and the egg question, because without density, you'll never get viable transit. I guess I say that, and yet in Connecticut, when we did an analysis of the Connecticut zoning atlas around train stations, we did see the majority of Connecticut communities, exclusionary type communities, had zoned single family housing around their train stations with large lots. That does not make sense as a land use to have around a fixed train station. But yet these communities have been invested in benefiting for decades from state and federal investments in the transit infrastructure, and not really changing local laws to actually facilitate that. So with that caveat aside, de-densify, I don't know if you would call it deregulating, but I call it promoting housing choice in suburban communities could, yes, increase density. Studies have seen that that's only incremental over time, but it is that density increase that then makes transit more available. I do think there are lots of opportunities within cities, but also within inner suburbs to make changes that could really benefit people. There is a tension between that and this idea that every community has to have a fair share of housing, affordable housing. That's been a conversation that's been taking place in Connecticut for a number of years. I think that we should put housing everywhere, of course, if we're possible, but in particular in places that already have population centers that have access to services and, yes, transit. So I think your question has a lot of different dimensions, and that's just really touching the surface in my answer.
Yeah. And I think the question also speaks to, the tension between transportation planning, a lot of which is done at the regional level, and land use and zoning, which is done at the local level. And this next question kind of speaks to that tension and looks for solutions to it. Padmini says, in which states are regional planning councils advocating effectively for zoning for economic development? So how are regions advocating, on the local level for changes that are beneficial to the whole region?
As I said, we do see some reluctance for regional planning, and I'll just say regional organizations, because regional organizations come in a lot of different forms, to approach state legislatures very directly on zoning reform. They might provide information about, again, employers not having access to a workforce, or the high cost of housing contributing to the need for wages to go up at a cost to local businesses and things like that. I haven't personally seen a lot of regional groups that have been very vocal in pushing for zoning reform, if they're economic development or governmental groups. There are lots of regional groups that have pushed for zoning reform if they are housing related regional groups. We work with a number of these all over the country. And just providing them with information about zoning in their region so that they can continue to push for reform. So I would say, we haven't seen a lot of that from a regional government, regional council, MPO type perspective,
Mm,
but we certainly have from regional housing organizations.
definitely. And Sarah, can you talk a little bit more about the Cape Cod Commission? Because I know you said that was a good example of a regional organization that has kind of dipped their toes into zoning and is thinking about zoning regionally.
Yeah, so the Cape Cod Commission, I encourage anybody to go to their website, has done so what they've done is they've invested in review both their own staff reviews and also paying consultants to do external reviews and reports on zoning. They have focused on housing and zoning in their annual conferences, and I know that because I have been to their conferences and spoke at one a few years ago, as we were launching the Massachusetts Zoning Atlas. And they also convene people. And again, for regional councils of whatever cast they come in, those have the opportunity to be convening organizations, to have conversations. Now, whether that translates into actual regulatory change is really in the purview and the discretion of those local groups. And so there's a balance between like, okay, we got to do this, and then, or there's not a balance. There's not necessarily a relationship between the most active regional groups from that perspective, from the education perspective, and actual change on the ground at the local level. So the data, however, that groups, including the Cape Cod Commission, pulled together, I think, especially in that case, have created an unmistakable case, have made an unmistakable case for new housing and for zoning reform. So whether they would say that directly, I don't know, but I think the data that they pulled together really speaks to a housing shortage on the Cape. Lots of short-term rentals, lots of non-owned occupancy, things that are very specific to their region, but things that they have highlighted in their reports as being issues of concern.
Absolutely. And I think, Sarah, you spoke to regional organizations' role as kind of, informal, not directly regulating land use and zoning decisions, but having the power of convening and then also having the power of doing the research and collecting the data to show that, these changes could really help in areas of economic development and housing affordability. Two more questions left in the Q&A. If anybody has last minute questions, please put them in there. Let's go to Levi. Levi says, what role do you see zoning playing in boosting economic opportunities, particularly in small towns?
I think I may have already answered this question in prior answers, but again, just to summarize, small towns have similar issues to any other town in that or larger towns. They have main streets that often, if they're small towns as opposed to new suburbs, so the census classifications, I guess, are the way we think about it, the zoning atlas. They often have historic main streets, so zoning for parking mandate, zoning for mixed use, zoning that enables housing to be located in and around those areas, zoning that has maybe a form-based component, so you don't turn into one-story strip malls with a parking lot in front. It turns into two-story buildings that are built up to the street and continue to create that street wall. All of these things are opportunities for small towns, just like they are anywhere else. So I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I would just reiterate those.
Thanks, Sarah. And then the last question we have is from Broxton, and he asks, Which states are next for the zoning atlas to do a deep dive in? Good question to end on because you can kind of look to the future here.
Yeah, so we are currently finishing the state of California. We're about to launch a mad hustle to finish the state of North Carolina, hopefully by the end of the year. We have ambitions to do the only three big cities that we have not completed are Chicago, Philadelphia, and Detroit. And I have been beating the bushes to find funding to complete the zoning atlas there because these are three areas where there are high levels of inequality, racial and economic segregation, economic development potential, and zoning could play a huge role in that. The reports that we've done statewide in Colorado, on Cape Cod, and Texas legislation have been really informative and transforming, I think, regulatory change and certainly discussion. And those are three areas that are my personal priority areas. So if anybody's out there with funding for our team for those areas, those are my priorities. We'll soon be completing the St. Louis Metro, thanks to the help of an external team. We'll also be completing the state of Utah, thanks to support from the State Property Rights Coalition, which is a state agency that funds educational groups like ours. And we're also working right now in the Portland, Maine metro area, although Maine, for anybody who's from Maine, has some of the worst zoning codes in the country, worse than California. That is really bad. So please help us in Maine if you're out there. We don't want to do the rest of the state because it is very, very complicated, but we will at some point before the end of the year, I hope, finish the Portland metro area. We're about a third of the way done there. So those are some of the highlights. I'd love to get New York State down in the books, but we're still looking for funding there. It's 1,500 jurisdictions, so it's a big one. And then my home state of Texas, we have about 700 jurisdictions to go on that map, and we're hoping to again find somebody out there who's as passionate about zoning as we are. It's a lot of jurisdictions to review in both of those couple big states, but I think we've seen once we finish the statewide report, it's very powerful and can help to unlock a lot of other things too. So if you want to see your community or region on the map, we also have a way to fast track those. It's a nonprofit organization, and we pretty much have a formula for how much it takes our time to put stuff up on the map. So if you do have an interest in getting your region or community up on the map, feel free to reach out with it to us. You can just reach out directly on the website, or I'm at sarah@zoningatlas.org. We'd welcome that. We want to fill this thing out. We're 7,800 communities in, but there are 33,339 in total. So we're about 25% of the way in. More to do.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for speaking today. I certainly enjoyed it. I'm sure our participants did as well. I just put in the Zoning Atlas website one more time. Again, this webinar is part of the Economic Development District Community of Practice, which is an effort led by the National Association of Development Organizations, funded by the U.S. Economic Development Administration. If you want to send this video, send some of Sarah's talk to your colleagues or to your regional partners, I'll be sure to upload this to the NARC YouTube channel later tonight. And thank you for all of your questions, both at registration and during the live. And I hope everybody can take these conversations and these ideas back to their regions and start some important conversations about the potential for zoning and economic development. Sarah, thank you again, and have a good day, everybody.